today's webinar, From PSO to PSB, a new model for creating differentiated brand experiences, will be presented by Kalev Peekna, One North's Chief Strategist, and Ryan Schulz, our Managing Director of Brand and Experience Design. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to those two to get us started.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
I'm going to start us off today with a phrase that we hear far too often within the professional services space, and I'm sure everybody has heard some version of it. It's something, you know, I think every profession has phrases that keep coming up that never seem to really get resolved. This one is something that's been bouncing around for decades. And it's that old phrase that I hire the professional, not the firm. I hire the consultant, not the consulting firm. I hire the lawyer, not the law firm. I hire the accountant, not the accounting firm. And this is something that we hear from buyers repeatedly over and over. We were giving that some thought, and we started to realize just not only is it not helpful, but it's kind of a ridiculous statement. So bear with me as we go through an explanation of just how unhelpful this statement is. You know, when people think about it, you know, we're going to use an example of a law firm here. You know, in some sense, what people are saying on either end of that spectrum is a little bit ridiculous, right? Buyers claim that they hire a lawyer, and it never matters what firm that lawyer is at. They would hire the same person no matter where they're at, which we all know in our gut isn't true. And, you know, the practitioners or the buyers think that marketers want you to just, you know, look at a brand, assume it's awesome, and not pay attention to the specific practitioners working on your matters. And, of course, that's also kind of ridiculous. We don't really think that it happens either way. You know, after giving it some thought, you know, I realized that this is what philosophers call une question mal posée, which is just fancy pants for that is a terrible question. And here's why the question is wrong. The first is you're asking the wrong person. Marketers know this there's tons of research all over the place. Cognitive scientists know this, psychiatrists and psychologists know this. But buyers or decision makers in general can be remarkably bad at understanding their own behavior. And I would say the classic example of this in your everyday life would be an airline and an airline ticket. You know, everybody complains about how crowded it is, that the experience is getting worse. If you actually ask, and there's data like this, if you do a survey and ask people, would you pay $30 more, would you pay $40 more for a slightly better onboard experience, the vast majority of people will say yes, but then when it comes down to the moment of purchase, what the airlines know is that you will actually just choose the lowest airfare that will get you from point A to point B regardless of the experience, right? And it's a classic example of why asking buyers in a straightforward way about their buying behavior doesn't always get you the right answer. You're also asking in the wrong context. It's just too abstract. When this comes up, it's usually on some kind of panel or discussion about the state of various industries. It's inapplicable to the real world. You at least need to start substituting a specific profession or a specific firm for you to start getting different results. And then finally, and this heads into our next part, it's set up in favor of one answer. The way it's stated is kind of ridiculous because no one ever really buys a firm, a company, or an organization. So let me explain what that part means. And so we're going to dive now into what I call the absurdity of buying a brand. The first example I have for you is just think about laundry detergent. Think about, do you buy Tide or do you buy Tide detergent? Now, the shorthand that we use when we talk about some of these products is to substitute Tide, the name of the brand, for the detergent. But as you get to the grocery store, what you're actually going to see attached to that name is a huge range of products, right? Not all of which are actual detergent, but this is actually just some of the products listed on Tide's website. It's not even all of them, but you can see it ranges from pre-wash, laundry detergent, things that are in pods, Tide pens, which are about stain removal, things that go in your dryer, and basically a full range of stuff. Now, you might have become so used to that in the grocery store, but for me, every time I think about this problem, I think about you know, this specific question. Do you buy a specific detergent for your laundry, or do you buy detergent from a specific company? Or to put it differently, would you really buy any kind of tie with the assumption that it worked well, or do you prefer, is your preference actually for a specific kind of tie, maybe based on the scent or the type of machine you have or the format you like? So I offer you an evidence of this continuing debate. My parents, who look very nice and normal here, a little later on their wedding day, they look like completely normal people and not like physicists who probably shouldn't have had children. You can tell they're physicists, by the way, because my mom on her wedding day is not carrying a handbag. She's carrying a camera. And my father has decided to get married in his work boots. Now, I bring up these two lovely people on the happiest day of their lives because after growing up with them, I know that one of the continuous arguments they had was about this problem of how to approach grocery store decisions, because my mother would write down on a grocery store list, Tide, and my father would get to the store, look at all the options, and then be forced to go out to the parking lot to a payphone and call my mother and say, well, what kind of tie do you want? And it was this endless debate with my mother on one saying, how can you not remember what kind of detergent we buy? And my father saying, why don't you just please tell me what you want me to get, right? Let's switch it to another product if you're kind of over laundry detergent, because it really works with almost any kind of consumer brand that we have out there. Think about Doritos. Most people like Doritos in some form. I love Doritos. Think about the same kind of question. Would I buy any kind of Doritos? Do I just buy Doritos? Or do I actually, what I'm actually buying is a specific kind of Dorito chip? This is, of course, a trick question. There are 134 different types of Doritos, including some really awesome examples. The one that we know and love is actually just Doritos Nacho Cheese. But there are actually Doritos Honey Chili. There's the ones from Asia. There's ones from Africa. You know, there's Cool Ranch, which in my bucket is kind of terrible. So really, you know, you think that when it comes to actually that actual moment of purchase, you're always buying something more specific than an individual brand. So, you know, we need to ask ourselves what's really going on here. Am I buying Doritos or not? Am I buying Tide or not? Well, what's really happening when we're talking about this with our own firms, with our own consultants, lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, is we're trying to talk about brand without really using that word. When we frame up this question of do people hire the firm or do they hire the individual professional, we're trying to ask ourselves what actually is the impact of that firm brand. And I think this hesitation happens for a lot of reasons. I think it starts with a misunderstanding of how brands function. And that's especially problematic in the PSO space because brands operate differently when the organization is based on people, long-term relationships, or primarily expertise.
And we'll get to the details of all that sort of towards the second half of this webinar. But I think it's important to start off at the beginning here talking about some brand basics. And most of the stuff should probably be review for most of the people on this call. But we're going to talk a little bit about some brand basics, how brands work, and why they really do matter. So starting with you know, some of the most basic fundamentals. Again, like I said, I think most people on this call really do know that when I say the word brand, I'm not talking about a logo and I'm not talking about a color palette. I'm not talking about a silly tagline that doesn't really mean a whole lot. These things are part of a brand and part of a brand experience, but really these are the building blocks of an expression system, a creative expression system that can tell people how to feel about a certain thing or can forecast what their impression might be of a certain kind of experience that comes from a brand. We know that especially in the PSO space, brand is very different. And I actually think it's far more simple than most people give it credit for. I think a lot of people like to overcomplicate what brand is, and hopefully you'll see throughout the course of this presentation that it is actually pretty straightforward. I like to say that brand is the conversation that's taking place about you when you're not in the room. And if you think about the stories that people are telling about your organization, whether it be on the recruiting front, whether it be on a prospect front or a current client front, those stories are really the only things that really matter about your brand. Now, I think there's some smart ways to connect that story back to a creative expression system so that they relate to each other, and we'll talk about that, like I said, a little bit later. But essentially, when people are telling those stories, they're talking about three things. They're talking about your reputation. They're talking about the relationships that you have either with them as prospects or as recruits, or the relationships that sort of revolve around your brand or organization. And they're talking about thought leadership that your organization produces. Thought leadership either coming directly out of your organization or coming from people that are part of your organization. And I think the important thing to note here is that the failure to adequately sort of talk about any one thing or any one part of this system or any one of these categories sort of surrenders your ability to categorize or to color that brand, that part of the brand story for your organization. So the failure to understand what each of these buckets really means, I think, is just giving away a big part of the conversation to those folks as they're attempting to frame it for themselves. Of this list, I think probably the most important piece is the relationship piece. It's connected to thought leadership, and there is a real relationship between those two things. But essentially, when we're talking about relationships and we're talking about the experience that is built over time with your organization, we're talking about the character of your organization. And so if you really want to make brand super simple, brand is all about character. And managing your reputation is not about controlling the message. It's really about controlling the character of your organization. And there's this great quote by Lincoln. All brand strategists like to talk about Lincoln because he has a lot of great quotes that can be abstracted into something that somehow connects with what I do for a living. But there's this quote that character is like a tree and reputation like a shadow. The shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. And essentially what he's saying here is that if you can manage the organization and what you care about and bring alignment to the things that are really driving your organization forward, the reputation is going to take care of itself. The conversations around who you are and what you stand for and what you care about is going to be inextricably tied to that character piece. I think one of the places where this comes, clearly into focus is in the B2B and B2C spaces, which is why we sort of started talking about some B2C examples. I know that in the PSO space, doing consulting work in this space for as long as I have, whenever we talk about B2C examples, people get in a tizzy because it's not directly applicable, and we agree. But I think there are some important things that we can point to sort of in those spaces that can help us start to frame our own experiences within the PSO space. In the B2B and B2C spaces, we often use the word brand interchangeably with the word company when referring to top performers, right? So we talk about Apple as a brand. We don't really talk about Apple as a company. We talk about BMW as a brand. And the thing that we're doing there in shorthand when we're talking about those brands, those companies, is we are using it as shorthand for things that take the place of top performers. These are all high performers in their space. They're all category definers. They're all industry leaders. They all have a performance story, a value story, an innovation story, a product development story. But folks that really sort of double down on these things in terms of the stories that are being told about them, we tend to more easily attribute the word brand when talking about them rather than just company. And there's something really important, I think, in that idea of seeing them as brands, because once you're seen as a brand, it's really difficult to erase the image of what that brand stands for from your mind. There's this great photo that I found a while back of this Coke truck. Obviously, it's a Coke truck, even though somebody took some effort to try and obscure what that is. But there is no real substitute for being top of mind or being that first sort of trigger that's connected to the expression system. This is just red and white, but it suddenly reads just like a Coke logo, even if the Coke logo has been sort of eliminated. And beyond the sort of being top of mind piece, there is real numerical value, quantifiable value, financial value in being seen as a brand in this space. Whether it be the B2B space or the B2C space. On the NASDAQ and the NYSE, there's some research that suggests there's up to a 50 to 75% increase in valuation for organizations that sit within those indexes that are seen as brands, and then up to a 70% increase in valuation for Fortune 500 companies of other companies that have equivalent product sets. Those are real important numbers, and I think there are some transferable things over to the PSO space for us in terms of the value that we see from investing in brand. But when we look more closely at the top performing brands sort of within our own space, I think what we quickly see is there's not a whole lot of household names on that list. In fact, I'm sure there are some unrecognizable logos on this list if you really start looking at it. Brands that you just don't even really, you wouldn't even know what category to put them in. There are certainly, the Accentures and the PwCs and the Discoverers and those things that show up more regularly from a day-to-day. But for the vast majority of PSO sort of organizations, we deal with what I call as the Sea of Sameness. The professional service space is filled with organizations that are talking about themselves in the same ways over and over and over again, generic value propositions that don't really communicate any real value about the organization. And this is not something that we see, I think, in the B2C space as much or in the hardcore B2B space. I think we see in the PSO space, people talking about being innovative and collaborative and trustworthy and a team player, but what do those things actually mean? Who would claim the opposite of any one of those things? There's nothing differentiating about saying that we're innovative or that we're collaborative. But these default words sort of are the things that sort of get claimed to be our brand principles or our brand platform time and time again. And it led Kalev and I to this conversation, which is the sort of the centerpiece for this talk, where we sort of sat back in our offices one day a while back and said, why is the professional services space like this? What causes it to sort of jump into this reflexive sea of blue, sea of same words kind of area? Is it that we don't care enough about our organizations? Is it that it's too expensive to brand? Is brand really truly just a four-letter word and it's so repugnant to the practitioners within our space that we can't bring it up? I don't think that's the case, because if you remember back to that list that I just showed you a little while ago, the sort of top performing brands within the PSO space, there are some household names, some top performers out there, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, EY, and these are the brands sort of within our space that are starting to dictate the rules. They're starting to cross boundaries. They're really starting to sort of blur the lines between what it means to be any single kind of company in the services space. They are eating law firms' lunch. They're eating the management consulting firms' lunch. They are doing accounting services. They're blending all those things into advisory services in places where they're allowed. And they're chomping at the bit to do so in places where regulation is on the verge of being rolled back. And this is the kind of thing that should be pretty scary, I think, for most marketers within this space who haven't done a good enough job of defining themselves and separating themselves from the pack. I do know that there is a little bit more to the professional services space in terms of why do we end up sort of in this sea of blue? Why do we end up finding it really difficult to brand ourselves? I know that, and this is especially true or more so true in certain verticals, that ownership structures present real challenges. Practitioners often own their own books of business. Business development and marketing often serve different masters. Brand really does require the vision of a singular leader. I think this is probably most put into clear focus in the legal space. All of these four sort of ring really true in the legal space. Leadership is often a sacrificial lamb to the pressures of the entire sort of partnership that is trying to push the organization in a million different directions. Business development and marketing are often being pulled in very different directions. Am I pitching the company, or am I trying to sort of promote the organization? But these things are real, and these are things that probably everyone on this call sort of feels on a day-to-day basis when they're trying to go about their jobs doing marketing. But I think it's important to, in the face of that, and even in acknowledging that, to understand that brand really does some unique things for your organization that other sort of marketing efforts, that other sort of communications efforts just can't do. This is not exclusive to brand alone, but I want to really put a fine point on some things that brand does. And so I'm going to sort of present a slide of ideas, and then Kalev's going to follow up with sort of his take on that same idea as we go through this next section. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth. But the first thing, there's three things that I think brand really does do in this space that I think it's important to put this on paper and talk about. First is that brand really does drive revenue. I do believe that it shortens the sales process by really framing your perspective ahead of you framing your perspective in conversation with the organization that you might be pitching to. It creates awareness because it makes you more visible, sort of separates you from the pack, from the sea of blue. You become that Coke truck or you become that gleaming light on the hill, at least it to some degree, before you enter the room in a pitch scenario, so you're not constantly having to define yourself out of a hole. It makes you sought out for reasons beyond simple conversion, whether you have some extra value adds to deliver through the form of thought leadership or some other sort of event series. These are all things that really, at the end of the day, drive revenue.
My take is always slightly more practical than Ryan's take. I think that's true in most situations. The way that I come at this is a little bit more simple. Brand allows you to charge more for doing the same work. A classic way to estimate the value of the brand, there are several different models, but in either the consumer side or in the B2B side, is to measure the difference in price, right? Well, for most PSOs, that comes down to a billable hour or some stand-in for that, right? Which is why we're saying there's a reason why smaller solo practices, whether that's accounting, architecture, legal, what have you, don't charge the super premium rates of $1,000 and up that we see for the large, large branded firms, right? There's a reason similarly, there's a reason those solo practices don't get the most impactful work, even when it's not necessarily a matter of scale, even when you don't need the army of practitioners to get it done. There's a reason that the large firms tend to get the most impactful, the most interesting work. And there's a reason they're not always the first to get the call, or in fact, most instances, not the first to get the call. That brand is what is allowing your firm to charge the rates that it's getting and to get access to the work that it's getting.
The second thing that I think brand does is it creates client stickiness. And what I mean by that is that I know from my experience in Kalev, I think would back me up on this, that the clients are attracted to more than just outcomes. The outcomes of the work that you do enable them to do a variety of things and enables them to sort of do business in a new and a unique way. But they are attracted to a lot more than just that. They are attracted to all the perks and benefits that come along with being associated with your organization if you're of an organization of scale. Branded touchpoints really do give clients value adds that can be differentiators in and of themselves. I think, E&Y, McKinsey, those organizations have done a really good job of creating thought leadership programs that are value drivers, even if you're not a client. We find ourselves constantly referencing them and talking to our clients about them because the work that they do is so interesting and unique. And it's helpful as an example of how to behave in the content marketing and marketing space. And then lastly, it really does give a bigger, better story to tell about your brand rather than just the singular experience that they're having with a singular practitioner. And it makes it easier for them to tell stories about you and making them sort of stick closer to you over the long haul.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, I think Ryan and I have been hearing from years something that often shocks some of our clients, which is that by the time they get around to hiring a firm, they're pretty confident they'll get the outcome from you or any number of your peers or competitors, right? And that's not what's actually driving that final decision. Another way of thinking about this issue of client stickiness is to understand where is the credit really going for that experience that you're providing for the outcome, for either the good one or the bad outcome. And the reality is that in most situations, it's the firm that takes the credit, despite the star power of an individual practitioner or even a practice or an office. And you can think about this phrase, we like to say, no one ever got fired for hiring IBM. That may have shifted to other practitioners. Nobody gets fired for buying Microsoft. But it's true, there's no such thing as no one ever got fired for hiring George. That's not a thing, despite how good George is, right? That credit that the firm brings a sort of protection, but a place for people to locate the feelings and the results of those outcomes in a way that actually protects clients. The firm also becomes the part of the story the part of the story that clients tell. To Ryan's point, it's literally the thing that they can actually mention rather than having to explain who individual people are. And the final point is when you think about lateral moves or a practitioner moving from one firm to another, which does happen, particularly within the accounting or the legal world, the reputation of the firm almost always outlives those lateral moves. In other words, like, despite the practitioner moving, the credit for all that work stays put within that original firm.
And I think the last piece, and probably the most overlooked piece, is that brand really does attract and retain talent. I think we all know that the war for talent is on, especially in the professional services space, the secondary degree space. And whether you're talking about a fresh out of school, fresh out of a graduate program or a law school program, or a more senior sort of lateral person, a strong, well-established brand story can really draw out like-minded laterals, making your sort of efforts to sift through the resumes and the people that you might be considering for positions just that much easier. It can make them more interested and you more interested in them. It can nurture new recruits and give them a sense of belonging from day one. It gives them a sense of purpose and drive for being part of an organization. It can offer a rallying cry that promotes cross-selling and collaboration, which is ultimately kind of the holy grail that we're searching for when we're trying to build strong talent teams. And then it gives employees an additional reason to stick around. Whether you're going through a slump, they're having a hard time with their portfolio, they're having a hard time with maybe a single kind of change management effort that might be going on. The story and the purpose piece can actually be the difference between losing a highly valued employee and keeping that person sort of through those tough times.
Yeah. As Brian said, we're in an era now of full employment. We're hearing from a lot of recruiters about the need to reach out. The thing that having a solid brand and a solid idea of what your brand is will do is mean that you won't have to find yourself at a loss explaining why the prestigiousness of your firm matters. Right? You won't have to compete based on salary alone, right? You won't feel like you're trying to dress up something that's actually unattractive to those late Gen Xers or Gen Zers. For the people coming out of school, they'll be able to connect on terms that are actually solid and meaningful to you as an organization. And for senior hires, I think people need to keep in mind what the mindset of those senior hires are. Most of them, as they're senior practitioners, they want to calm their clients by telling them they're headed somewhere good, right? That brand is an immense assistance to them in terms of making that jump safe for themselves, but also safe for their clients. They don't want to have to call their clients and say, I'm moving from firm X to Y, and have to answer a lot of questions like, well, what is Y firm? Right? They want to be able to say a name and have all their clients say, great, can't wait to start working with you again soon.
So let's talk a little bit more directly about what it takes to actually kind of become a brand in the PSO space, or rather, I want to walk through three things that you need to keep in mind if you're thinking about bridging the gap between a professional services organization and a professional services brand. The first one is that your brand positioning really does need to align with your brand's actual experience. These things can't be divorced from one another. And now, like I said at the beginning, they ultimately inform one another, but this is where authenticity is really important. It's what I like to say, authenticity meets aspiration. You should try and find a positioning or a brand story that is on the edge, the leading cusp of where you want to go, but something that is still authentically true. If you choose this very, let's just say a very client-friendly, easy-to-use brand positioning that you sort of want to start talking about or start using it as an explanation for what it's like to work with your organization, your actual client experience better track to that. Because if it feels more like a full-out brawl, you're going to end up in a difficult spot down the road.
This is something that I think Ryan and I see pop up in lots of different parts within different PSOs, sometimes in really unexpected spaces. So we have worked with a client where a big part of their brand platform, a part of their promise really was about being easy to work with. This is part of what they were offering the market. And they really leaned on it as a differentiator against their coastal competitors. Now, when they started comparing that to data that was coming back from their own client satisfaction survey and data, they realized that they they had a real disjoint. In fact, what they kept hearing was that they were the opposite of easy to work with. They were, in fact, difficult to use, and it really just centered around invoicing, right? Now, that's not an aspect of the client experience that a lot of marketers often think about. It's not an aspect of the client experience that a lot of practitioners think about it, right? It's literally often after the work. But it was enough to create dissatisfaction with the client. So the solution was relatively simple, right? Take a process that is irregular, opaque, confusing, contradictory, and offer transparency. Put up a simple website or portal where people can see every invoice that they have, what the status of it is from your point of view, the details on that invoice. It doesn't do a great deal more than that and provide invoicing data. It's frankly the kind of information that you and I might get automatically or expect from any e-commerce store. What have we ordered? What is the status? How much did it cost? But it was enough to finally make a really important aspect of the client experience truly easy from the customer's point of view.
Second thing is that I think there is a really strong relationship between reputation and brand awareness. We talked a little bit about a couple of the levers early on that sort of make up a brand story. But specifically around reputation, I think there are three things that really make up a brand's reputation. The first is thought leadership. The second are the client experiences, so the kinds of the relationships that are taking place over time with individual clients and the stories that they're telling. And then the last is obviously the results. That middle piece, the experience piece, is one that is kind of sometimes can be a difficult one to manage and figure out how to authentically fold into your brand story. We have this client example. We've been working with a client for a while that had developed a reputation as being somewhat of a sweatshop years ago, and a place that just sort of churned through new recruits, and it was not maybe as enjoyable a place for everyone to work as they wanted it to seem like. But they decided to sort of take that difficult-to-own story and figure out a way to authentically tie it to the story that they wanted it to be. So this is a little bit of communications planning, this is a little bit of PR, but it's also had a lot to do with kind of the core attributes of the brand. So shifting the story from this idea of being a sweatshop to saying, well, maybe we just work harder than other firms. And also let's layer on a story of we care a lot about our people, and let's demonstrate how we care a lot about our people. And let's demonstrate how we work harder than others. Let's share stories and proof and through results and thought leadership. And the result was a shifted story of being a dynamic powerhouse and getting themselves away from the story of being a sweatshop. So just kind of, this is an illustration of how you can take something that might be a difficult reputation and turn it into a brand story that you really want to embrace across your organization. And then lastly, I think professional services brand architecture is really quite different than in most other markets. And this is kind of the crux of today's talk. And this is where, a year or so ago, Kalev and I were in his office and we were talking about why is brand so hard in the professional services space? And we kind of got each other talking and thinking about maybe the model is just broken. Maybe the professional services space needs a different way of thinking about how to build a brand. And we've been kind of talking about that ever since. So we're going to walk you through sort of that brand model right now. But first, kind of a quick primer on brand architecture in general. Again, I think most people on this call probably know these three different models. This idea of a house of brands or a hybrid approach or a branded house on the right-hand side. So house of brands being sort of a quiet or more distant parent company that is not as present, and then individual branded equities sort of living within that portfolio. The kind of thing where you don't get a lot of benefit out of knowing that your toilet paper and your toothpaste are made by the same company. But you get a lot of value knowing that they're both stable organizations that are backed by a large global organization like P&G. And so you want distance between the individual products in the portfolio. On the far right, you have FedEx, where there is a lot of benefit knowing that you have a ton of different options to buy across the spectrum. And then in the middle, you have Marriott, where you're taking the best of both those models and then applying them based on the persona that you're trying to serve. I think most professionals, most of probably the folks that you guys work for, most of the partners in your organizations, most of the folks that are out there doing the work, when you talk about brand, I think they think you're talking about P&G. I think most professionals, when they hear you talking about it, they think that you want to push them towards something like a FedEx model where they become irrelevant and disappear into the wallpaper. But again, that's where this model kind of breaks down, and we need something that's a little bit different. So I'm going to walk you through sort of stage by stage what the different layers are in this, what I'm saying is a different kind of unique professional services brand architecture model. I think the first thing that you need and when you're starting this process is a clear idea of whatever your umbrella brand is. It's that first thing you want to pop into anyone's mind when they're thinking about your organization. This might be something that's a really big differentiator. It might just be something that is kind of a definer for your organization. So maybe it's a huge global platform with really powerful expertise sort of in each individual sort of discipline that you have. Maybe it's something as simple as that. Maybe it's got some other colorful language that's attached to it that really draws that idea into clear focus. But having that sort of set and established and bought into by leadership across the organization is really important. Then the next layer down is the sort of practice or discipline brand, which is built out of that umbrella brand, but it's tailored to specific practices, disciplines, or maybe even geographies where we know that the story has to shift and be shaped a little bit in order to meet the audiences that they're trying to serve. And then driving a little bit further down is the practitioner brands. I think every practitioner in the PSO space is very aware of their own personal brand, how they deliver client service, and they take a lot of pride in that story that they've built about their reputation, as they should. But helping them find a way to tie that back to the discipline, the geography, or the practice that they serve, and then to that umbrella brand, making sure those three things are truly connected is the only way to sort of allow for lots of interpretation across your firm, across your organization, while still having a connected client experience that somehow mirrors that umbrella brand, so that when the stories are told about your organization, it feels like it's coming from one place. There's not a singular story told about Kathy in such and such a practice in such and such a region, and a different story about Tom in a different region, and those two stories don't match up, somehow diluting your ability to tell a reputational story. It feels a little bit more connected and like a singular story that can be driven throughout.
I think it's a good point to pause, but then just to highlight some of the things that make this different from some of the other brand models. It's not, I think, just the fact that we're introducing the notion and layer of practice and practitioner brands, because, right, Ryan, in a house of brands scenario, there might be an umbrella brand, but, there are individual constituent brands. People have seen master brands and sub-brands and micro-brands before. What I think is really interesting about this for PSO is it's not just the way those things feed in, but the notion and recognizing that client experience actually comes out of the micro touchpoint, out of the individual practitioners. You see, in this model, it's very deliberately placed at the bottom because that is the main point of contact between you and your client. And recognizing that those layers of experience are happening between you as a marketer or the firm overall and what the clients are actually experiencing is really important, right? And recognizing that those are the channels, if you will, just kind of how we've illustrated them, but those are the pathways by which you can get to and affect the client experience and the reputation, right? I think other models very often have the reputation kind of lifting off the umbrella brand, right, off the top. But it's very important to recognize that from here it comes out from the grassroots, really. That's what really drives things. And so if you are in charge of the umbrella brand, if that's the kind of marketer you have, if that's the responsibility you have, I think you need to recognize that that's the pathway in front of you to really be able to manage that reputation.
So let's unpack this a little bit further because I want to make it really real for you guys, and I'm going to continue to try and drill into this so I can make it as crystal clear as possible because, again, this isn't rocket science. I'm going to show you sort of how we approach building a brand platform, how we approach sort of doing this for our clients. There are a handful of different ways that obviously you can go through this process, but this is just the path that we take. So for us, when we're building an umbrella brand, we pay attention to 5 things. The most important for us is this idea of essence, or the brand idea. It's that first thing that pops in your mind when you think about an organization. So when I say Apple, or when I say Harley-Davidson, or when I say IBM, it's that first idea that pops into your head, that image that you get when you're imagining the experience of buying one of those products or using one of those products or services. And then, as a way to distill that down, there are sort of 4 things that we use. First is positioning, second is purpose, third is persona, fourth is promise. Yes, they all start with P, and that is on purpose to help you remember them. But also, I think it's important to note that they all do very different things sort of within the communications realm, and they lead to different kinds of messaging that sort of are focused on different kinds of audiences. And so there's a lot more complexity sort of to this first piece, but this at a glance is what an umbrella brand kind of really looks like. As we drive a little bit further down and we're talking about the practice, discipline, or the geographical brand, really we want to focus in on the positioning and the purpose. So we're tailoring, we're tweaking that main large story, that main first platform, and we're adjusting it and making it really, really specific just for practices and disciplines and/or geographies. And then it gets down to the practitioner, which is really all about positioning and differentiation from the competition. Here's my background and experience. Here's how it leads potentially to different outcomes or benefits to you. This is what you're going to get by hiring me in relationship, in concert with my organization, and what you're going to get out of it. And then lastly is the client experience, which again drives you back to that idea that pops into your brain. It should be that first thing once you've experienced the full force of an organization. It should be pretty natural that that idea that pops in your brain connects back to the story that's being told at the introduction. But let's make it even more clear, and I want to give you guys an example of what this could look like. So we're going to look at a hypothetical professional services brand. Let's call it a management consulting firm called Advisage.
Why not?
Why not? I'm sure there's an Advisage out there.
Yeah, well, there will be after this.
And maybe there will be after this. Here's how it works. So, Advisage, their umbrella brand, let's just say their umbrella brand is, let me click to the next slide, is showing you the way. They have this sort of stage guide that sort of is their primary sort of umbrella brand for the firm. And then as you drive a little bit further into a practice, like let's say an advanced analytics practice, maybe the messaging becomes experience that sees around corners, right? So showing you the things that are hidden, showing you the things that can't be seen because there's something in your way, but they've been there and they can see it. And they use data to be able to tell that story. And then let's look at a specific partner within that organization, Patricia Maker, and on her bio page or somewhere when she's talking, she might give you the example. Like, here are 3 ways that I have helped clients see around corners. So we're connecting that idea of foresight and vision directly back to that umbrella brand, but it's touching every single part, even though it can be tailored to different practices and to different partners. When we blow that out a little bit further, you can start to see how the firm story is played out across the overall look and feel, the firm narrative. The practice story is played out across practice copy on the website and practice brochures and events. And then the partner language shows up in biomaterial, speaking events, pitches, proposals, press. But again, this isn't rocket science. This is how you take a singular message and you start making it a little bit more digestible and unique for individual parts of your business that really matter, while still retaining some pathway back to the original story as you drive it through.
That's one of the overall points I'm trying to say is that consistency doesn't have to mean just rote repetition of the same messages in the same channels. And I think that's one of the, I bring it up because I think that's one of the objections we often hear to really handling brand, or why people sometimes feel that brand efforts fall flat within professional services firms. Because I think the practitioners are afraid of too much repetition, that they're going to make everybody seem completely uniform, right? And they know that they're not. Or that it starts to, look really, there's this idea of this brand dragon marketer who's going to enforce that everything looks exactly the same. And I think the point we're saying is that there's really no need for that degree of uniformity in order to achieve connectedness.
Yeah. So just a couple things as we kind of wrap up here. I think at the end of a talk like this, I think most people are asking, like, where do I start? That feels like a lot. Or I have a couple parts of this, but I'm not quite sure what to do with the parts that I have. I think it's important to take a step back and look at how you stack up on all three levels, that firm, practice, and partner sort of level, and think about what you have documented. How does your brand story sort of connect across those different things across your entire organization? And then start to clarify those things, right? So whether you're using a partner or not, start to clarify those stories across the different parts of your organization. In order to do that, you really do need to identify advocates and champions internally at every level. So from the associate and sort of new higher level all the way up through very senior leadership within your organization. And you need to make sure, like I said earlier, that you have somebody at the most senior level of each sort of individual center of power within your organization bought into this project, so you can start to build advocacy and some momentum across the organization. I think the third point, I think it's helpful to find a trusted partner to help build and document the work. That doesn't necessarily need to be another agency, although One North would love to be your agency to do that. But I think it is helpful to have an outside partner, be that person that can look at you through a critical eye and really help kind of hold the mirror up close to your face and tell you who you really are, and help maybe build a story that you wouldn't have thought of.
I think that objectivity is really important. I think, it's one of my, at the top of one of my mind, a very recent experience as somebody just understanding that organizations through no fault of their own very often develop a language for talking about themselves and develop their own sense of what different terms mean. And it's very easy to lose sight that those meanings aren't shared outside that firm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, particularly in the PSO space, we often find firms making statements into the market about who they are, what they do, without a full understanding that, people are picking up meanings that are slightly other than what they intend.
Right.
Right? And again, it's not through anybody's fault. It's simply because, every firm of a significant size develops its own culture, it develops its own way of talking, its own sense of what words mean. And so that notion of an outside perspective will really help you keep yourself connected to the way that the way language is used within the market itself and how you're actually really being understood, which is super critical to this stuff.
And then the last piece is really identify what your path's going to be and commit to that long path with really actual outcomes. I think it's easy to get started down this path of saying we're gonna in 2020 we're gonna do brand, and get into the second quarter and lose track of what your outcomes are really going to be, what the plan is, the documentation maybe you built up earlier, the research that you built up earlier, maybe ends up sitting in the drawer too long or on your server someplace, and you don't quite make it to the end. Because this is a long road. I mean, to move from being seen as an organization to being seen as a brand, it doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of coordination across leadership, across the organization, and it requires some clarity and depth of understanding about who you are to really make it come to fruition. But I do think that it's within the grasp of sort of any professional services organization out there to be able to make this transition. And I hope that you guys can all sort of find the path forward and do put in the hard work because I think you'll find it is worth it in the long run.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan and Kalev. I'll say that there have not been any questions that have come through yet, so unless one comes through while I finish, I'll give everybody about 9 minutes of their day back. But that being said, if you do have questions afterwards, if you flip through the slides once they're available and the recording and something pops up, feel free to reach out to us at marketing@onenorth.com and we'll get you in touch with Ryan and Kalev. So thank you again, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.